Mr. Justin Garrett Moore, I am so happy to finally have you here on the Institute of Black Imagination. You are a wealth of so much information and experience, and I can't wait to share that with everyone. So, welcome.
Thank you, thank you. And I know it took us a minute, but happy that we finally can have kind of a more open conversation, can reach some other folks, hopefully.
Absolutely, even though we live down the street from each other.
I know. And, yeah, still on Zoom, right?
So to begin, who would you like to dedicate today's conversation to?
Oh. Um, I'll say that I'll dedicate it to all of the people that we should know, but have been robbed of the opportunity to know them. People in our communities and Black communities in particular, there's been this ongoing willful harm, erasure, and loss that clearly impacts all of us in the world. And so I'm always just mindful of that. My father does a lot of kind of genealogy work, and he's sort of constantly searching for more about ancestors in the family. And once you kind of learn about them, it's like power. And so I just think that there's so much power that is still out there in our histories that all of us can mine and share. So I dedicate it to all of those.
Amen, amen. And may this conversation be an ancestral
Ooh,
conversation
yeah.
to help empower
Yeah,
those in the future,
yeah.
and that's actually a really great place to begin. And just thinking about placemaking and what does it mean to find our bodies in space? Like, what questions should we be asking about the spaces we inhabit?
Yes, so many layers to that question. To first sort of unpack space and place a little bit, and that there are all of these layers of things that are shaping our experiences and our interactions. Uh, Everything from environment, right? The temperature, the quality of the air, to things that we have created and shaped, right? The sort of constant communication that we're trying to have with one another. Place is actually one version of that, right? You know, you go to a place that's meant for exchange, like a market, right? And we humans somehow shape the space to do that, to communicate to each other, exchange. Places to be kind of thoughtful and quiet, right? So all of these things are sort of layers to space that we have to acknowledge the power that it has. So people, sort of being in their world, their existence, just acknowledging that the place is a part of you. So it is important to pay sort of attention and to look for all of those layers about what a place is telling you. The other kind of piece that is related to that is that there's an indigenous saying, Wakaka Waka people that were sort of in the Pacific Northwest, what we call the Pacific Northwest. You would say that a place is a story happening many times. And so the idea that when you're in a space, reading the space, kind of understanding what happened there, like what that place's story is, what that space's story is something that I think is important to kind of register that, because this becomes an issue in how, again, we interact with each other. So the more that we sort of know a place's story, the more we can respect that place, we can respect its people, right? All of the interactions that have happened there. So that sort of intersection between story, history, right, that carries our cultures, and what is built, right, what is visible and tangible, right, putting those together I think is sort of the literacy, let's call it, of space that I think we need more and more in our society.
Yeah, and just, to bring it into plain sight, I live in Harlem. I walk out of my door onto, Morningside Avenue, and I look around and I see, five-story tenement housing, and I see, development happening to the west from Columbia University. Um, and, to the south is this commercial corridor of 125th Street. As I look around, how should I be reading this tangible space? And what are the stories it's telling me about those who created it?
Yes, I love that. I love that. When my background's architecture and urban design, and years ago, had a great mentor, Moji Barler is her name. So I was in her studio, and she had us at the time with a colleague or classmate blindfold us, Papu 42nd Street, and say, walk to the water blindfolded, with someone to watch you to make sure you can get hit by a car. Right? But the blindfolding was so important because, like, tapping into the other senses in a more direct way is sort of the first step. So it's sort of this process of, like, not only privileging the visual, kind of what you would read, what communicates fastest as environment, and to tap into sound, smell, and touch, right? So in that process, you sort of learn, like, I have to touch the city.
Mm.
Right.
Mm.
So and everyone kind of has that sort of understanding of, like, touch is a great way to communicate, right? So if you think it's my responsibility to touch the city, we're taught not to touch, especially pandemic era, right? We touch everything with a cloth, but the idea that feeling a place is multisensory, first of all, is key. And I think the multisensory can also be kind of in kind of the psychological and kind of intellectual part of the mind, right? What's your multisensory approach to reading the space? And so the layers that are there, right, of how the street wall, in the design field, right, the street wall of 125th Street being continuous, and then there's a moment at Grant Houses where it is no longer continuous, right? Because the Tower in the Park housing model sort of breaks the street. And so kind of registering that, right? Like, why is there a void there now, right? It allows you to sort of ask questions. What is that space now doing? How does it function? Or how does it not function, right? So you begin to register that there's a fence, right? Instead of a door. Right? And like, just walking down the street, right? There's per street and there are doors, people are coming in and out. We walk further down the street and there's this rebuilding that took place, right? That took something away and put something else there in its place with kind of a paradigm for how people should behave there, and replaced what would have been a continuity of doors and windows with, iron preventing you from accessing a space. So, like, those are kinds of things, and you can just say, oh, that's, NYCHA, or that's Grant Houses, right? And you can sort of register and process it that way. Or you can think about, why is it built this way?
And why is it built that way?
Well, it was to divide, right? The public housing campuses. There was let's call it the white imagination of Tower in the Park housing, like Corbusier with the hand, and this is the city, right? They're very proud of how they've touched the city. That imagination that people should live in this way in the container, and then you have the open space that will provide for a healthier interaction with their environment, right? Like that was a concept that was put in place to sanitize the city, right? To control people like lower income people, people like Black and brown people, in different ways, and it is that space of white imagination that has become irreparable harm to so many of these communities. So when you're walking down the street and you see that change, that shift, that space, just know that there are so many layers there, right? And so just like that kind of concept that the space should be built and configured a certain way was clearly possible, it means that other ways are clearly possible.
I love that. To actually just get to cities, like, you exist and have existed, in multiple spaces and have approached the urban landscape through multiple lenses, through the worlds of architecture, city planning, urban development, design, development at, local, national, international scale. What is it about the city and the built environment that continues to enthrall you? And I posit it through the lens of you as an artist and the city and space as your practice. And so, why the medium
Mm.
of the built environment?
Yeah, I love putting it that way, the medium of the built environment. And it is a kind of a form of practice. And it's a very slow practice, right? Like, the thing is like, the city changes very fast but also almost glacially slow at the same time. And it has to, that's the medium, right? It's both a fast and a very slow medium
Mm,
that you're trying
mm,
to navigate like at the same time, right? It's like, if you're a painter and the viscosity of the paint changed like while you're painting, kind of, because of the political processes and capital. I mean, there are lots of things kind of flowing your way. So it's like that's of interest to me, right? That it really operates in like all of these different ways. Uh, I think I'm sort of fascinated by difference, and so I would say that's like the kind of the driving interest or question that I have. And so those of us that are in architecture, design, urbanism, built environment work, right? Our business is that cities change, right? That the
mm-hmm,
built
mm-hmm,
environment
mm-hmm.
change, right? That humans, for whatever kind of constituent set of reasons, are constantly like, remaking the ant farm, right? And so, the fact that this change is happening is like, it's just fascinating and interesting to me. But then there's also kind of when you're in an environment in a city and any kind of a community and you're traversing it, right? If you have some kind of mobility that you can traverse it, you also recognize that there are all these different kinds of places, right? And
Mm.
that there are people and decisions that led to that, and that's just very interesting and powerful to me. And so my work in urbanism is sort of constantly driven by this question: how does difference register in the city? How does difference
Mm.
impact me personally, right, my community, kind of globally? And it just has every possible scale of question, right? This bench is designed in a way that it's comfortable, or it can be designed in a way that is comfortable for people that are only sitting upright. Right? It could be designed that it's comfortable only for people that don't need a back to sort of support themselves. Right? So it could be that small of a scale, or it could be the scale of the way that we build produces a certain amount of carbon that makes it hotter and hotter. And now there are airport tarmacs buckling in Northern Europe. Right. So like that whole range of scale is something that we're able to constantly, like you said, play with, right? It's like it's the medium that we get to work through.
Yeah, I love the scale of design, and I also look at it through this lens of this continuum, right? This almost kind of like fractal nature,
Yes.
from the genesis of the language and the syntax that we speak, right, as a way of design and speaking about reality, to a park bench, and it's interesting because what I love about this space is the questions that it proffers,
Yes.
because underneath it has all been decisions, right? And so there is a why to everything that we witness. So if you're talking about something as, you know, quotidian as a park bench, there was a series of decisions that created the design of that and the ways in which design can kind of obfuscate its intentions. So you have a park bench that is not completely open and long. It doesn't have a back, but it's a park bench that, every 12 to 16 inches is,
An
an
interruption. Right.
armrest, right?
Yeah.
But it's an interruption that is designed to look like it's for comfort, but it's actually designed to keep homeless
Exactly.
people from laying down, right? And so, or, you go to lower Manhattan and now every skyscraper, is partitioned with
Bollards.
bollards,
Right.
around. So for listeners listening, bollards are those kind of like steel cylindrical, masses, let's just say that. Usually that's how they're designed, that surround buildings to keep, cars from running into them, or, to protect from
Terrorism.
terrorist threats. And so, it's understanding that everything has a reason,
Yes.
and then, asking, the why. But, I remember when we first met, and the thing that fascinated me the most about you was your your kind of practical and pragmatic lens in thinking about city, right? I come from a place of like high emotion, and you're like, no, but this just makes the most sense.
Right. Right.
And we had a conversation about, I think we were speaking about like Atlantic Terminal in Brooklyn, which is one of the most used transit hubs in the country.
Right.
Actually. And I was speaking about, an older Black woman, who has a brownstone above Atlantic Terminal. And there is the city trying to use eminent domain in order to take her brownstone. And, from my lens, I'm like, well, but she's what I'm attached to her story, right?
Right.
This is a Black woman who has achieved and overcome and pushed to educate in order to manifest this dream of a brownstone, that a place that she can call her own. And you're like, tear it down. We need to build a tower.
Right.
That's completely selfish. So how do you how can which just cut me to the bone. And so how can we think about this? Like, what does it mean to live in community, and balance the dreams and balance dreams at human scale?
Right. Yeah, and it's it's very funny because that definitely throws people off, right? It's like, how could you like be for the people? But it's like, and that's exactly the question, right? Is one of at sort of what scale of responsibility and collectivity and kind of understanding are you working within? And so, when I came out of grad school and started working directly for city government, right, like literally for the people. And so in that process, you sort of go to a lot of meetings, you go out in communities and you meet and you talk to people, and you get more and more sort of laden with multiple stories, right? So yeah, there's the one story, and there's and the same kind of connectivity and empathy and alignment and value kind of find with that. But then let's say you have another compelling story and another compelling story and another connected story that may actually be kind of in a holistic sense, one that requires more action, right, or more engagement, right? Some horrible things happen to people, and it's like there's a responsibility to actually intercede, right? So I kind of have that perspective from having, from in my early 20s, it being my job to like listen to all of the different things that people want and need from their city, and it's a lot of different things. And so like that suddenly becomes a different frame to think through questions in space and decisions and tough decisions like, should this little 3-story cute brownstone go to make room for a big tower? And it could lead to other conversations, right? Like what would be the adequate compensation for someone like that who has built their life and has something that is valuable to the society? What should they get for that? And so that's a different conversation, right? But assuming that conversation happens, then it could open up opportunities, right? So on that, theoretical spot where that one lady's brownstone is, there's a major redevelopment that occurred, and you have much needed affordable housing stock that has hundreds, if not thousands, of families now that have their story about living at that corner, right, into the future, right? And from a global sense, rather than having lots of people in little 3-story buildings using up all the resources, there are other ways that are more responsible environmentally, right, to live. We're responsible in terms of mixing of incomes in one community instead of segregation of income. So it's just a different scale question. But I think that, again, that multivocality of stories, like being able to kind of hold and value that is what sort of drives that way of being kind of pragmatic, while acknowledging the things that are very bespoke and rich and individual, right? They're not pragmatic at all. But that's how I sort of process it.
Yeah, and I mean, and your answer, I was just like, I mean, okay, yeah, I guess, and if you think about it from a level of like sustainability, as you said, like it's actually much more. Well, first of all, it's so much more sustainable to have, this tower of individuals living above a transit hub
Right.
than to have multiple people individually, using resources, having everybody has the house in Connecticut,
Right.
the auto emissions of the driving, like there's actually this larger kind of conversation or solution that it can provide for.
Yeah.
But like you also have, I mean, let's take it back to Indiana. Let's take it back to Indianapolis.
Yes.
Your origin story. You have. You spoke about your father earlier, but I understand that there is a history of building and planning, even in your family.
Yes.
But even before we get there, tell us a bit about Indianapolis and growing up in this city and the ways in which it began to shape this this curiosity about difference.
Yeah. So I grew up in Indianapolis, Hoosier, and I grew up it was a wonderful community. It's a neighborhood called Meridian-Kessler. Kessler learned later in life as a famous landscape architect, sort of like an Olmsted. But anyway, growing up, so we lived in this, what we acknowledged or what was sort of framed to us as the inner city, a predominantly Black community, predominantly kind of either working and middle class community. And so I grew up in segregation, basically. And I mean, it's like, it's weird, like, because it was just like my environment, my community and everything, but sort of, growing up, like, you had to, when you left the neighborhood, there were white people, or if they were white, but kind of in the world they grew up in, it was a Black community, it was a segregated Black world. There was one white neighbor on the block, cool guy. But the sort of context is sort of growing up in a Black community, in a Black environment, sort of one thing, but then at a certain stage in your life, right, you start going other places. And so this is where the difference thing comes in, right? So growing up, there weren't parks, in our sort of area. And so we play in what we call the coal field. So it was state fairgrounds are nearby. They had a coal storage yard for way back in the day when people used coal to heat things. But they hadn't been used a long time, but it was this big, giant vacant lot that had like all this little kind of coal in it, right? So that was like where we went to play, was what we called the coal field, right? And so then so you get a little older, right? You start going to other neighborhoods and you go and from to neighborhoods that have parks. And it was like, oh, this is like there's grass and trees and, play equipment, things like this is something to sing as a kid, right? But where those parks would be in, white or at least whiter communities, right? And so this is something that, as a child, it's like, okay, we've got like the what we call the coal field, and then you would have a neighborhood park, right? And there was a difference that as a kid I could see there. So like that's where it's like it starts registering more and more. And I enjoyed the feeling of being in a place that was well invested in, that was green, or like had cool buildings. I was interested in buildings as a kid, right? So like, oh, that's a cool building to be there. Versus like, oh, there's a bunch of like vacant houses, you pick it up, right? And so I've always been interested in that, registered it, and eventually kind of learned that that's something that you can do personally, professionally, is be a part of that. So that's how I got into design.
Which is wild, but your father, you has this genealogy project, but then your grandfather was also very much involved in kind of design, really urban design and community building, specifically this project called the Flannery Houses.
Yes.
Could you talk a bit about that project and the ways in which the community really came together in order to create and design the things that it needed?
Yes, I love it. And I always, every time I talked kind of at length about this work or the field, I make a point to introduce at least the work that, a Black leadership of planners, community leaders, urbanists, designers, architects, et cetera, are involved in with this history of Flannery House. And I'll pause to say that like there's this idea of the Black canon, right? Like the kind of the knowledge of the past, of people's intelligence and innovation that needs to be more centralized and to become things that we all learn about, and things that provide kind of a base for a different future, right? Different kind of possible future. And so there's this group, Flannery House. They were a kind of more of a social services organization. So think today what we would call like mutual aid is what they did quite a lot of work in.
And what time is this? I'm sorry.
So they started in the late 1800s, but they were sort of at their peak and sort of scale in the 1940s and 1950s. So kind of post-war era was really when they were kind of fashion. There's an incredible leader, Cleo Blackburn, was the sort of the lead of the organization that was able to kind of see comprehensively what were all the things that the Black community, which was a segregated low-income Black community in downtown Indianapolis, needed to, sort of A, survive, but B, to thrive, right? To kind of have a great future. And so my grandfather, who his background was in agriculture and food sciences, worked for this organization. And what he was doing for that organization was he was effectively kind of the Will Allen of his day. He ran a large-scale urban agriculture program in inner city Indianapolis for Flanner House. And so when they were developing these programs, it was because they were responding to all these needs they had in their community. So their community, they had food deserts, they had high incidences of diet-related diseases like diabetes, right? So there are these things that we still talk about today, food desert, diabetes in Black and brown communities, et cetera. So they were still dealing with that then, because these, racism isn't new. And so they created a whole program where my grandfather helped people learn how to grow their own food and how to sort of balance their families' lives nutritionally. And so they started with these sort of smaller programs. They call them self-help programs, just to teach people basic skills and to provide kind of basic infrastructure that they needed for healthier lives. And so when they were doing this, they were building all of this kind of knowledge of their community and the community's interactions. And they took it like very, very seriously. They even got sociologists involved to kind of learn, well, in our community, where is the power and where is the ability and where are there things that are missing or compromised? And they actually spent the time to talk to everyone in their neighborhood and kind of understand that while they were designing these programs. And the reason they did that is because they were looking for how can they push to reshape their community, right, for the better. And so they found out that there were all these people that wanted to be able to have a nice home. This was a neighborhood that at the time, a lot of people didn't have indoor plumbing, for example. And so people wanted to be able to improve their homes. And so they developed an entire program to rebuild their neighborhood. And they hired a Black architect named Hilyard Robinson. He is sort of famous for doing housing projects across the country. And in school, if you have a good professor, you'll learn about him. But you won't learn about this project, right? You'll learn about projects he did for white, people in terms of their imagination for how housing should be done. But the Black version of how housing should be done was that families would build their own homes, right? They would get the sort of the support they needed from people in their community that knew how to build. They would get support in terms of kind of pooled financial resources that would be kind of returned to the community. And people built their own homes. They built over 300 homes designed by a Black architect in inner city Indianapolis in the 1950s, right? And what's even more sort of compelling, because they had the families built their own homes, they had equity in the homes, and they were able to get mortgages. They were able to get FHA mortgages in a time where it was very rare for Black people to get FHA mortgages, right? Right. So people that know the histories of kind of discrimination within the housing finance system in the U.S., redlining, et cetera, the kind of the mortgage loans was a big kind of piece of that. And so they were even able to kind of counter the discriminatory financial systems at the time through design, right? Through kind of how they work together with their community to build these homes. And so it's just incredible, because it's literally a story of a Black community with Black leadership, Black design, Black innovation that created a whole community, right, of a part of a major city in America, and you never learn about that in school, right? So it's a powerful history, but it's really wonderful because today there's, for example, Habitat for Humanity. For those who don't know, it's an organization that people can, with volunteers and with homeowners, future homeowners, labor, right? You can lower the cost of housing and do it at scale. And so there's a national network through Habitat for Humanity that people now have this housing model. Well, this group of Black people was doing that 20 years before Habitat even existed, right? Right. At scale, right? 300 homes is large enough to say that it's at scale. So it's a great history, and I always joke with people, at some point I'm going to write a book about it. But in the interim, I just love, helping people see the story. I can share with you a link of an actual video of them doing the homes. And the thing to remember about it is that they were working on lots of different things, right? Like my grandfather was helping people while they're doing the homes. They're doing the gardens and growing their own food and teaching people how to cook healthier food, right? They're doing work related to people starting their own jobs, right? They had a credit union, they had a cooperative grocery store that my grandfather ran, right? Like they're doing these things that are essentials for their community and thinking comprehensively about it, right? And I think that's, again, the thing that ties back to this idea of how we communicate and interact with each other was something that they invested a lot of their time in, right? Because, one, because they really had to, but two, I think it was just a certain way of thinking about how you would change your community that's different from the way that is sort of the dominant way, which is, there's a problem, you figure out some kind of framework for how you're going to change it, and some power structure operates, and then things are imposed on people, and some people live with it or some people don't, right? Like that's more the dominant model, but that was not how they operated, right? They really took the time to learn their community, learn what the needs were, and then sort of allocated their resources and innovation accordingly.
I love that you posited or position the idea of space making contemporaneously as the dominant model, right? So it's interesting to think about what this community of Black individuals were doing, in the 40s and 50s, in relationship to the ways in which we just accept the ways in which space is made. And so, in that kind of rich history and us, in present day being on the other side, and so to speak, like what are the learnings there? Like what are the design technologies that this community created that can be implemented into or could solve for maybe some of the major voids that exist in the dominant narrative of building?
Yeah, I think one that I think is starting to change in the way practice is done, but they first did this really connected and rooted way of in the field what we would call kind of engagement of people, right? Just like basic interaction. So not developing a process just based on how the rules say the process, require the process to be, right? You have to go to like a community meeting or a council member hearing or something like that. So there are those structures. They were working in a much more grassroots way. It was, hey, Sandy, go ask Cheryl if she can come to the meeting tonight. Like it was like, that's how they were working. Like it's kind of around dinner tables and kitchen counters and those kinds of things. Right. So like that scale of work of saying, okay, well, this has to be an interpersonal interaction, I think is something that is very powerful. And, people are starting to work that way. Like there are even jobs and positions now for people that just do kind of community relations and interaction and planning. But it's not in the same I think kind of groundedness and authenticity and purpose that I think that they had, right? Like they had manifestos, right? Driving their work, right? About, the health of their community, right? Kind of outlining things like rights to opportunity, right? So there are these sort of things driving them that I think we don't have in the same way in our generation. But I think there's a lot to learn from that kind of social practice of interaction. I think there's also something to learn from what I see is their. It was sort of a motivation that their knowledge was really valuable and powerful. Something about this organization, one of the reasons that, like I said, eventually I'll write a book, is that they documented just about everything, right? I can find what my grandfather's kind of time cards were, right? It was very well documented. And the idea that they were kind of recording their own history, right? Like they sort of knew they were making history, right? And so like that kind of mindset that they were building information and building knowledge that a future generation could benefit from, or that it's important for people to be able to learn and understand what they did. I think that, and again, for that time frame, that wasn't necessarily, again, a normative thing to do. But I think that acknowledgement is really powerful. And I think the more that when we do work or when we're trying to innovate, that we make a point to share it, is part of knowing that you're doing work in a way that's meant to scale, right? It's meant to connect and reach more people.
Yeah, I find this story super interesting because I think there's, on one hand, it circles back to what you mentioned earlier about what does it mean to have access to one's history, and the ways in which it can empower, right? So yes, the archive, but also like in the practice of making the actual documentation of process, so that it isn't something that is ephemeral, but is something that can be referred to. And then I think thirdly, it speaks to the active erasure
Yes.
of these histories, right? So what does it mean to create an archive, and yet the dominant systems that exist, part of their functioning is also the erasure or the obfuscation or the hiding away of that information, right? Which keeps a contemporary generation from even an ever understanding like from whence they came, right? The story that they hear about themselves is the story that they've been designed to hear about themselves, and that is their only reference point, right? In the Americas, it is, the narrative of slavery, and yet there were so many other incredible ways that Black and brown folk were thinking and doing, that we don't see. And it's actually a part of what this podcast is. It's part of like kind of my my motivation as well, is like, we're both from the Midwest, and growing up in a very traditional American education system that I excelled in on some level, and yet was completely unprepared, and it was completely inefficient for me actually understanding who I am in the world. But circling back to you coming out of Indiana and going to school and then getting into city government, I think it's really amazing. A lot of people don't think about the ways in which policies shape space as well, right? Because it's not just about land, it's not just about the food, but there are policy architects that are also designing how close that food is to you, whether or not there is a park within a certain radius of where you live, and that affects, right, your personhood, your sense of self, even your own like personal well-being. And so, being in the space of city government, and most recently, in the de Blasio administration in New York City as the executive director for the New York Design Commission, like, what lens did policy give you in understanding the built environment in cities? Because that's a pretty unique, I think, perspective.
Yeah, and so I worked in city government for 16 years, and the last 5 of those years were as a head of agency, where the policy sort of component of the work was much more kind of central. But it's something that as I mentioned, when I was younger, I kind of saw these sort of differences in environments, and I actually started in architecture very young age. I started working at an internship in high school, and we would go to like the planning board meetings. when they were trying to get something approved, and that was, sort of seeing like exactly like there's someone's kind of discussions and decisions that determine, whether my park is going to get improved or not, or funding is going to go to housing in this neighborhood versus another. And so that kind of policy thing is something I was sort of always a little bit curious of.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was going into government, it was just really kind of sobering how poorly our system works. It just doesn't, it intentionally doesn't work well, right? So you have decisions being made in the political sort of arena that don't have the information or knowledge needed, right? There are kind of people working kind of in their communities directly to sort of build a solution, but they're automatically put in some kind of oppositional relationship with existing regulations. And so the kind of role in government, in planning and policy in city government, where you're literally just trying to shift the rules constantly, right? Like you're pulling the lever to see if you can get different outcomes. And so understanding the layers of information and kind of background and research that really need to go into making a policy decision is something that I really appreciated having that exposure. One of the projects I worked on kind of over many years in city government was Hunters Point South in Queens on the Queens waterfront. And so that was a project focused on housing affordability, right? Which is the big Gordian knot of New York City problems, right? How to get more people affordable housing. And so there it was literally understanding and navigating all the levers, right? A policy comes out of Washington, D.C. that says that this certain bracket of housing can get a lot of good kind of federal subsidies or layers, right? And then a law comes out of Albany that says you can do this, that, and the other. And just seeing how, like, literally we're doing our computer models at the time, how things are like changing while these policies are coming out of, Washington and Albany and even within New York City Hall. And just seeing those kind of changes and levers, like, okay, well, if we shape the building in a different way that changes the cost of construction, we can get more people at this lower income range in the neighborhood as we're building it, right? Or this new environmental regulation is going to unlock some grant funding, and so we can change our park from very standard design to something that has a little bit better design, and we're putting that in proximity with the lower income level housing units, right? So you're kind of like doing the 3D chess a little bit, and it's fun, but it's also very challenging because you're making a lot of kind of difficult choices along the way. But that kind of understanding of all of the inputs that policy has is a way to then say, okay, well, where now can I pull the levers and sort of see what kind of alternatives are possible. And that's where you get into the place more when I was in leadership of city government, like really pushing the boundary, right? Okay, this is how things work. This is how things might work better. And I'm going to generate a policy that puts that in place, right? And so we were able to do that in different ways with kind of how we require a certain amount of public input in a more robust way, through to really experimenting on how do you get higher quality design and higher quality environments for things like affordable housing, and then insist that we actually use those things instead of the current model, which costs just as much money but for a worse result, right? And so rather than leave all of that to market, let's put together a framework for how we make sure that we get the best possible result for the communities that need it. So it's important. I loved having that kind of hat on. You don't always win, but when you do, it's great.
Yeah, and I think what I found so fascinating, even when we first met, was that there was this extremely powerful individual that I met, all compacted into this tiny little black queer body, living in
Yeah.
Harlem, and so what ways has your perspective of and even like your queerness like informed the way you view design and your
Mm.
space within it?
Mhm. Yeah, it's very funny, and especially for those listening, like I have kind of a small stature, sort of unassuming type. For years it'd be in meetings, and people would be like, who's in charge?" And like they never assume it's me. It's like I'm in charge. Um, but the sort of stature aside, the there's this uncomfortable relationship, I think, with power that uh, people that are kind of in any kind of a marginalized community feel,
Mm,
and that's definitely something I personally have kind of felt and navigated, for sure. Being on the outside or on the margin or kind of not valued is something that is sort of, it could be conspicuous, right? It could be very blatant or apparent when you're in a room with a lot of quote unquote powerful people, and you're the only one of your kind. And so that idea of kind of the margin is something, being at the margin or marginalized and all of that, or these sort of structured kind of power terms, that is sort of navigating, and instead of kind of accepting that, it's more like kind of finding the power ways to navigate those spaces, and also to kind of find your community outside of those spaces, to yeah, just challenge that kind of feeling, right? The kind of the imposter feeling that can come sometimes, creep into those spaces. And so I would say that the that idea of seeing and knowing the beauty in the community that you come from
mm-hmm.
is just always there, and to just sort of register, that there's this other world too, and these other powers and spaces of power too, and to be able to use that to be fully present, right, and authentic and grounded, and say what you're going to say anyway. Because I'm unassuming and things, people are sometimes like shocked when I'll say something that's very, direct or shady or something like that. But it's like it's done with intention and with purpose, and it could be quite effective. And and people sort of know or realize, understand that you're real, right? Like, I'm actually not here to be you, right? I'm not here to operate the way that presumably I'm supposed to operate to advance, because I'm not interested in that, right? And so, when that is sort of there and it becomes apparent, you can get some real work done. I'll say that.
Wow. And how did you find that voice?
I mean, I would say it took time, for sure. I would say that I'm kind of personality wise more of an introvert, and so I'll be honest that I kind of just watched and learned and listened for a very long time. I would say kind of easily the first 5 formative years of my career, I was really just taking it all in, to be honest. And I'll say that there was one moment in life that was pretty pivotal. I had a really, really great mentor. I mentioned her before, the Walking Blind Through the City, that faculty member. Moji Bartler's name. She was an Iranian architect and urban designer. And she had cancer and passed, and it was something that was a really difficult event for me, um, because she was like kind of an opposite personality. Like she was very like outspoken and uh, demanding, even kind of personality, like opposite of me. And when she passed, um, I was sort of thinking there was like a little cricket on my corner kind of a thing that would be like, okay, like what would she do sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
or what would she say? And I think it was kind of a switch that flipped that like I have to be present and kind of uh, direct things and not always be kind of in the background or trying to do things kind of under the surface, which I would do, and you can be effective under the surface too, by the way. But I really started saying and doing things more directly, more uh, sort of insistence on, uh, frankly, my power or the power of really trying to get the thing done for a community, for a place.
Mm.
Because it sometimes it really does take a stance and uh, aggressive, for lack of a better term, place. And obviously, you can do it in a way that is respectful and nice and genuine to your personality. But it's something that I think there was kind of a switch where I decided that this was how I needed to operate.
Mm. I mean, Justin, your um I'll just say the manifestations of your practice versus your accomplishments. The manifestations of your practice are like so wide. I'm like, okay, so do we now talk about you building housing in Rwanda, or do we speak about you working with the Biden administration on the Commission for Fine Arts, or do we speak, about philanthropy, and even your own projects of urban patch
Mm-hmm.
back in Indianapolis and black space. I mean, there's so many ways to go, but I think it'd be really great to hear about this project in Rwanda, which I'm like, okay, Rwanda, like
What?
I don't, I'm just like, what?
What?
But
I
but it was,
know.
but I also got to witness the building, right? The building process. And then also like the completion. So it's quite wild. Like, tell us about this project. Like, what was the
Sure.
genesis? And I mean, I know there were challenges that were then met, and then something came of it.
Yeah, so it's definitely random, and yeah, people that meet me, it's like you sort of like unassuming, and then like I do lots of random things that don't sort of fit when you first meet me. But the background to that story is that Urban Patch, which is the social enterprise that I have with my family, it's focused on kind of design, urbanism, development. That whole project was inspired by my grandfather's generation in Flanner House and the fact that these people were doing innovating things to build their community. And so we had various projects in Indianapolis, and to sort of build it at that scale wasn't something that we're able to accomplish. And I had a very good friend from grad school who was working in Rwanda, and so I just went. She would say, "You have to come visit Rwanda. You have to come visit Rwanda." I'm like, but eventually, like she sent me some pictures, and I was like, "Okay, it's pretty there. I'll go." So I visit her, and I was just really taken with the place. I admit. Obviously, they've had an incredibly challenging history, even recent history. When you think it was, within our lifetime that the genocide occurred, and you go there, and there is this nation, this sort of group of people that are actively working to solve their challenges and to be together, right? Like it's palpable. Beautiful, beautiful country. It's very clean, very green. But they have these big challenges with housing. It's the highest population density, like per square kilometer, anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. Incredible growth since the genocide. So in the genocide, around 1 million people killed. But since then, there's been significant population growth, and so they have huge challenges with building housing. And so this is work that my friend Fatou Da is her name, that was there, is engaged in, kind of from the policy side. And so they were asking people for different ideas, different approaches for how to build housing, and affordable housing, housing that people from Rwanda could afford specifically. So you're there, and I'm like thinking, well, what if this sort of model that I've been hoping to do in the U.S. but not able to because it would be multi-millions of dollars, let's try a version there. And so we were like, sure, let's do this crazy thing and figure out how to build affordable housing. And so what we did is we developed a model that essentially wouldn't require any government subsidies because it would be the first version of mixed income affordable housing. So in Rwanda, even when they would build housing, it's tended to be segregated by income level, by class and cost, right? So you have very wealthy neighborhoods, like, everybody's got the gate and the McMansion, and you have neighborhoods where they were building the equivalent of kind of public housing or low-cost housing concentrated in one neighborhood. And so we developed instead a model that said, well, we can build in desirable neighborhoods that have things like sewers and services, good access to kind of mobility and transportation to the work centers, those kinds of things. We buy property there and build mixed income housing, right? So you have some units that are higher cost and some units that are affordable to Rwandans in one development, which is common in other parts of the world, obviously. You could get housing built in the neighborhoods that have those amenities, right? Instead of building the low-income housing in only in neighborhoods without those amenities. So that was a model, and we just did it. We sort of tested it out. We got some assistance from graduate students at Columbia that look at things like social enterprise modeling. And so we did a research visit to Rwanda and looked at things like property values, construction costs, et cetera, and calibrated and created a housing development model that allowed for mixed income housing. And we built a pilot project in a neighborhood called Kibagabaga, which is sort of a more upper income area of Rwanda. So that was the concept, is like, we're going to try it. And of course, some things worked, some things didn't. We were sued at one point because we were building, a mixed income building that would have lower income people in a rich neighborhood. And so the neighbors tried to sue us. They didn't win because everything we did was legal according to zoning and all those things, right? But have you ever been sued in another country before? It's crazy. But we won, and now that the project is done and built, and so the affordable units, right? You've got Rwandan people living in this great neighborhood with housing that they could afford. And so after it's there, right, it's fine, right? Like, it's a nice looking building. They wanted us to change the fence, so we were being nice and we changed our fence to match the other fences in the neighborhood, even though it doesn't go so well with our beautiful brick building, but whatever. But that housing is now part of that community, right? And people are living together, and people who otherwise wouldn't have been able to live in that neighborhood can. So it's great, and we finished out that model, and now we're looking for our next project. So we have to go and find sort of a model that you have to calibrate to find the land in the neighborhood that is well serviced enough, right? That you want to mix the kind of the income and demographic profile there, but it's not so expensive that you can't afford to build affordable housing there. But it's been great in the process. We were intentional with many of our steps, right? So we could have done everything externally, but we had a local Rwandan architect, right, that we brought on board to do all the permits and things of that nature. Even the geotechnical company, being intentional to work with the local Rwandan businesses, so that the money that we're spending is recycling into their economy and their businesses. That even included the bricks themselves. So one of the kind of cool things about the design, there are two different colors of brick that we use in the building. And the white brick in the building is from a Rwandan woman-owned brick factory. And so like just knowing that that kind of material supply has an intention so that, women-owned enterprises are kind of receiving the benefit. And it makes the building more beautiful, right? To have this challenge. And we couldn't afford to do the entire building with our brick because our bricks are more expensive because it's more it's like almost like a boutique brick maker. But it makes the building more beautiful that it has this sort of variety of input and material in a way. So it's a wonderful project to be able to kind of push and test ideas, and it has bigger impact beyond just our project. So it was one cool thing, like during the process. So the neighborhood we were in, and this is getting slow into the planner worm rabbit hole. Sorry, but a big issue in planning and design in cities is economic segregation. And one of the biggest tools of economic segregation in planning in cities is something called single-family zoning. So in the zoning maps of a lot of cities, they'll have designations for what kind of housing or what kind of buildings you can build in a particular neighborhood in the zoning. And there is sort of a condition that happened in Europe and the U.S. as kind of a dominant model to plan a city, is that you would have a scale of different zoning districts, like a downtown commercial district with high rises, all the way down to a kind of more suburban neighborhood fabric that has what's called single family zoning. So on the land, you can only have one dwelling unit on that piece of land by zoning. And that model was exported to the rest of the world, including Rwanda. And so there's this city in Africa where there's low resource, there's extreme topography, there are all these things. But the kind of the colonial way, this is how you build a good city, got mapped onto that place. And so they had, in a city with a housing crisis, large swaths of single family zoning. So we complained while we're building our condo building. We're building an 8-unit building on a single family kind of neighborhood context. And so the city happened to be going through a zoning change at the time. And we made the argument that they should not have single-family zoning. And the folks in the Rwandan community were sort of interested by that question, why did they do that? And it was because it had been imported from places like America and Europe. And they were like, in our culture, kind of traditionally, you wouldn't really have, because they were families, right? They were living in a completely different model. And so they processed it and they got rid of single family zoning for the entire city of Kigali.
Whoa. Wow. Catalyzed by this project.
Catalyzed by our project. And in fact, when you go to, it was funny, we went back recently, and in another city, not Kigali where we built our project, but another city in Rwanda, they had a community session, and they're talking about zoning, and they had a picture of our building as the example on their thing about how they wanted to build mixed income, different types of housing, because it's like a compound. It's essentially like a condominium is just a compound, right? It's a kind of social form of housing that they're interested in. So it's just cool, and seeing that the work has kind of influence and impact even beyond your little project or square.
That's amazing. And how does that relate to, you have other projects that you're involved in, Black Space, which is a collection of Black architects and planners, and And I think this is really through the lens of impact, right? That the ways in which you're working as a professional, right? Going to an actual job or working with, a company, but then there's this other practice outside that is
Mhm.
having a kind of impact at scale, right? Like in an international way, a policy way, but then also about, providing, opportunity and community building around Black individuals thinking about the built environment. How do you relate that, and what prompted the creation of Black Space?
Yeah, and I mean, I always love the opportunity to talk about Black space because it's something that is sort of born out of just the need to connect and to work together. So for those that may not be familiar, Black Space is a collective of Black urbanists, designers, artists, etc., that we initially all met at the Black in Design conference up at Harvard GSD. And, there are all these wonderful conversations about kind of the histories of Black communities and work that people were doing. And it was just sort of like a spark goes off. It says, okay, this is a space that we can continue to have and to grow and to develop. And so folks that met at that conference just started connecting and meeting together kind of in social spaces, at brunches, things of that nature, to just talk about a different impact, right? A different kind of practice. Some of us working in government, some in nonprofits, some in private sectors, or working independently. And there is this drive for wanting to have a different impact, right? From the work that folks were doing day to day, by filling and being constrained by dominant models and practices. Again, I keep saying this, but it's really something that we're just navigating all of the time almost. And so this idea that we're going to build a different practice, a different impact, a different way of working was something that was there. And so this is something I think we were all doing in our own individual ways, right? So different work kind of than what I was doing. And I think, at the same time, I'm kind of building out Urban Patch, and my own kind of work is happening kind of in parallel with something like Black Space, or now something like Dark Matter because it's the way to kind of channel what's the best way to shift things, or the best way to kind of see some progress that I cannot do on my own, right? And that is a way to kind of have greater sort of anchoring to what I want to do and what I don't want to do, or what I'm good at and what I'm not good at, and just accepting that instead of trying to do everything yourself. Probably not able to do all of it well. I think having those different spaces has had this kind of, I think it's like an empowering effect, because you just sort of know that, you can be whole in one space for a moment, right? So there are times when I need to kind of really, in a concerted way, invest in Black communities, Black practices, Black culture, and Black space is a space for that. With Urban Patch, I have a desire to physically build and transform, right? And there's just that part of me, and so in that space, I'm able to do things in that kind of direct, built, spatial, real kind of community way. And so and just having those different spaces of practice and different communities of practice is so enriching, and I'm able to learn and kind of pivot from one to the other and take something I learn in one space and bring it to the other. And that includes my own kind of, job and role and practice that I have professionally. And because I've had a kind of a relatively clear upward trajectory and kind of career profile, it's because, frankly, I'm operating in spaces of different impact that I've been able to kind of learn and innovate and develop in one space and then bring it to another and progress, and bring it to another and progress. And it's something that I think people increasingly see and value, that the kind of the quote unquote polymath, right? The person that is operating in different spaces is something that I think people are understanding and valuing that more and more.
Yeah, it speaks so much to the power of not only diversity of peoples, but a diversity of thought and experience, and the ways in which
Absolutely.
they strengthen each other and
Absolutely.
allows for advanced pattern recognition across multiple
Yes.
fields, right? And so that they actually it's a compounded learning, it's a compounded way of becoming, which then actually makes you uniquely qualified to do
Right.
the thing, to do the next thing, which is actually a beautiful segue in speaking about like the next thing, because you are now like the inaugural program officer of humanities in place at the Mellon Foundation. So,
Yes.
moving from this place of, urban design and planning, doing your own projects as a builder, actually building spaces in New York City, like actual waterfronts and watersheds, and working in city government, to now being on the side of philanthropy, which is very new. And as we've had our dinners, I've noticed very, very tiring work.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about like what is this new program at Mellon, and what does it mean to have a foundation, right? Like this really putting real capital behind these
Yes.
projects.
Yeah. Thank you. It's still kind of a new kind of thing, a new space for me. So I've been the foundation like a year and 3/4, and a quick kind of anecdote is that when I was at the end of my last role, end of the administration, and thinking about what the next step in the next place would be, it was, do I continue kind of on this track and path, or do I do something different? And I was kind of called and kind of recruited into philanthropy, and initially I didn't want to do it, I'll be honest. Because I had always worked in government. I always worked kind of with a direct responsibility to the people, and obviously a lot of good things happen in philanthropy, but by and large, for the most part, it's like the exact opposite, right? Philanthropy, like there's some small number of people that have power and resources, and you sort of execute their will, right? And so for me, coming from government, directly from the public, that was like, diametrically opposite. But in the conversations with folks at Mellon, including leadership Mellon's led by Elizabeth Alexander, and I really was sort of taken that leadership was completely purposeful in saying that their work needed to better directly connect to people and communities, their places, their stories, and that they were that the foundation leadership kind of like as a part of their work was going to move away from only focused on kind of the conventional institutions, right? The university, the well-established arts and cultural organization, whether it's a museum or a symphony, right? Like that was kind of the association that I had with that type of philanthropy. But there was a very kind of clear and focused and demonstrated commitment to this reframing of what many people would call social justice work, that who was benefiting from the work, how it was being done, was seeing an active shift. And so that was what convinced me that Mellon was worth it. And frankly, because it was a new space, a new program, that I would have enough ability to kind of shape that and kind of set the tone for how that work would happen so that it felt direct, for lack of a better term, that the resources and the approaches would go to the actual places. And because the program is called Humanities in Place, like it's about place, I was like, okay, that's enough for me to go into it. So I make the shift, and it's funny. It's like, so Mellon's an esteemed large institution is existing, but it was literally just me. And it's like, create a new program, start things off. And so it's like being a startup within a big established institution. And so that was kind of an interesting process. But what was great is that we were, for example, able to build a team that was flatter in structure, for example. So when we're working with communities or doing our research and kind of processing things, like it's sort of a team effort that allows for more conversation, more inquiry, more sort of, like you said, kind of having different perspectives as an important kind of thing. Multifocal, multi-perspective approaches to work is something that we were able to build into our practice within the foundation. And so we've been able to support by now over 70 organizations across the United States, a very wide range of place and community contexts, wide range of stories, wide range of different types of people doing the work that include things like heritage spaces, like preserving important kind of places that contribute to our history, but also can contribute to our future, right, by way of how they're reimagined and how they're kind of activated and programmed by artists and community members. We're able to do work that is supporting new institutions and new frameworks. The Black Reconstruction Collective, the group of 10 Black architects that recently had the show at the MoMA, formed a collective, and we were able to provide support for that organization to really develop and advance their work, but also to continue to support Black artists and Black designers in reimagining and rethinking our spaces, whether historical or contemporary or future. So we're able to directly provide resources to the places and the ideas that are there. And we're able to kind of have conversations about what's the most effective way for that work to happen. Sometimes it's very direct, like something needs to be built, right? Something needs to be saved. But sometimes it's that, we need a process in our community to talk about our history and the harm, but also the positive and the honorable, right? And so we're funding that kind of work too, where people are investing in their archives, where people are having conversations about what does social justice and equitable development look like in their community today. And in some cases where we are supporting kind of institutions, we're directly supporting historically Black colleges and universities, for example, or Asian American organizations. There's one called Angel Island, where they're talking about the histories of Asian Americans and their kind of social and cultural sort of legacies that have shaped America, right, but are excluded from the American story. So it's a wonderful space and opportunity to be able to provide resources. We've granted over $70 million so far across all these different organizations. And it's just wonderful to be in a position to have an infrastructure for directing resources. One thing I'll mention, we talked about Flanner House earlier and the the work that they were doing. That work was supported by philanthropy as well. There's back in some of the records, there was it was in one of the records, a check for $100,000 written by Eli Lilly Jr. at the time, which is today the Lilly Endowment, is the Eli Lilly money in Indianapolis. And so it's like recognizing that philanthropy did have, a role in beautiful, wonderful things happening that I had as a very tangible example. And so that was something that I kind of take with me and hold with me as we're having these conversations and thinking about what we resource, because it truly can make a difference in these communities.
Yeah, that's incredible to even consider. Just the legacy and the ways in which philanthropy has and can aid.
Can. Yeah, it could do the exact opposite
Yeah,
too.
exactly. And I think as we kind of double tap on this um, idea of philanthropy and kind of wind down, like, because philanthropy is also a system, right, built
Oh
within an
yeah. Oh
existing
yeah.
framework,
Ooh,
right? So
ooh, boy.
the
Yes.
issues that we deal with on the street creep up. You know what I mean? Like they exist within these systems as well. Uh, this by design. Levels of access or inability to access the resources with which to um, rethink and rebuild our communities and our world as those on the margin, or black and brown individuals. Like, what ways can we think about and get access to philanthropic dollars, right? Because there's so many mechanisms in place to keep you out, right? To block that. But how can we think about philanthropy and best prepare for access to this capital and resource?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the you're exactly spot on. Like it is a system too. It is, I'll go as far as say it's a white supremacist system that is kind of it's like a release valve for capitalism, right? It's
Mm.
like for the fact that it exists is part of the rationale for capitalism sort of continuing, right? Like, okay, yeah, people aggregate huge amounts of wealth, and that's an inequality, and they say, oh, but there's this mechanism by which, it gets redirected, right? It's a form of preservation for that system. So the the system that it creates is still one that is an aggregator, right? Like it's meant to be something that distributes, but it largely functions to like, it's the constantly doing this, right? Um, um, and the pressure and the system feeding itself is a whole industry. And so, there are organizations that have people that is their full-time job to get money from philanthropy, right? Guess what the composition and mission of those organizations that have full-time development people looks like, right?
Mm-hmm.
They tend to be whiter and or more established institutions and organizations, and all the people that have a greater need for the resources, right? They don't have the mechanism to do that, right? I get calls all the time. Oh, let's meet up. Let's meet up. And I'm in New York. Let's meet up. Right? It's like, okay, if you have the resources to come to New York and have coffee with people, right? Like you're at a certain kind of stage of privilege and power that a lot of people that are the communities and places and people we actually want to support, they're not happening on New York and dropping by
Mm-hmm.
to have coffee with people at the Mellon Foundation, right? So like acknowledging that system is there, and so we actively try to break that down. But one thing I'll say is that going after philanthropic dollars is something that happens largely in networks and kind of spaces that you're um, putting yourself in and forcing yourself into, because
Mm-hmm.
very often they're closed spaces. You may not even know those spaces exist. So it's difficult, but have to kind of understand and navigate, like, how do you get into those networks and connections through a lot of organizations. There are events and convenings that happen all the time. I mean, when we met at Idea City, right? That's kind of one of those kinds of spaces that those connections and interactions start getting made in, and they're very kind of personal to a degree. The other thing I'll say is that philanthropy is starting to open up a bit more, and if you go to like organizations' websites, there'll be contacts and different programs. You see, okay, this organization funds a lot of the work that I do and I'm interested in. It does work sometimes to kind of just reach out directly to the program, what's called the program officer, program staff that's working on that, and to see if you can have a conversation. And obviously more and more, because of Zoom and everything, like, people are a little more giving of their time in person meetings. So that's a mechanism. And then there are, for folks that are, you're not a nonprofit organization, you're not incorporated, right? You don't have all these structures in place. There are organizations called fiscal sponsors that you can connect to and see. Fractured Atlas is one that folks use a lot for arts and performance. There's something called Producer Hub. And so there are these organizations that can help you, even if you're not set up and structured as a nonprofit entity. You can work with them to get sort of support to be able to accept philanthropic dollars. And then obviously a lot of people, just try to do things, right? Like, just sort of test it out, like have your first proof of concept. That's the key, right? Have a good proof of concept, something tangible that you can show and demonstrate your ideas. And when you have that, then you're in a really good position to kind of, socialize your idea, right? Like get the word out, see if there's interest and support, and kind of tap into some of those networks. So multiple ways to do it. For those, those of you listening, if any of you are in kind of place-based, kind of place and heritage or place culture or arts and place, if you're interested in that, go to the Mellon Foundation website, look up Humanities in Place, and drop us a line. Like, on the website, there'll be a section for inquiries there. And I'll say, in our grant making, a good number of our grants have been to people that have just reached out on the website and said, here's my idea. One out of four, in fact, of our grants is someone that, just shot their shot. And that can happen too. It's honestly not a ton of philanthropy happens that way. Our number is pretty high because we're intentionally opening things up. But that is something that is possible too. And you just find the foundation or the organization that is supporting the kind of work that you want to do.
That is the formula, Justin. That is so good. And, even in this moment, I have to give a disclaimer that the Mellon Foundation has helped and funded the Institute of Black Imagination is a big part. I mean, what we're doing right now is a direct result of the philanthropic dollars of the Mellon Foundation. Shout out to Deb and those on the team. There is no conflict of interest here. That happened before Justin was there.
Yes.
But
I'll just quickly say, if you go to the Mellon website and just look up the organizations Mellon has been funding, like, there are a lot of cool, wonderful organizations, and it's like a network of people doing incredible things that the foundation is supporting at the moment.
Yeah, it's and for listeners on my end, there were so many grants. Actually, this podcast is a direct result of me getting denied grants, right? Like, applying for creative capital, applying for this, and getting shortlisted, but not quite getting there. And so I just wanted to do something, right? I was like, I don't want to wait for permission. What can I do with what I have now? And I was like, I can afford some microphones and I can begin at least having this conversation, right? And so also thinking about this process as a way of perfecting your idea. And so I
Yes.
use a lot of applications as a way to prompt questions that I'm not even thinking about. You'll do an application and it'll
Absolutely.
ask, you know, how do you plan on engaging your local community in this idea? And that was not something I was thinking about, but I'm like, that's a good idea. And so then I have to lean into my imagination. I have to dream. How
Yes.
could this actually be a direct service to the local community, even though there's this other thing that I'm thinking about? And so thinking about the application process as really a collaborative effort, even before you reach out
Yes.
to the grantor, uh, as a way of shaping the vision that you have in your head, because we only know what we know. So we're only asking the questions we know to ask. And so to have that kind of back and forth is actually a way of even just becoming, right? Becoming and creating the thing that you want to do. Justin, this has been such a rich conversation. You are just a wealth and a storehouse of love, really. If I want to get
Oh,
down
thank
to it,
you.
that's the truth. And so before I ask my last question, I just want to acknowledge like the tireless, and I know that tireless work that you do at every level. For me, I find you superhuman. I find it almost impossible that you're able to accomplish all of the things that you do without drinking coffee. Um,
Yeah,
you
no
know, and
coffee.
and it's always transparency, it's always openness, it's always, this is how you do it. This is how you create, a financial model of building, an urban redevelopment project in your hometown. Like you just like, here's the chart, here's my Excel sheet, these is what the houses cost. Like, and that is the kind of not only friendship and relationship, but the kind of lens on world building and community that we need. We just need the information, right? And then people can then make of it what they want. And so, and I know it comes at a great level of, I think, personal sacrifice and is really an act of service. But what's incredible is that you are also doing the work, right? Like it is not just theoretical. It is not just
Yeah,
about, a
yeah.
conference, at an Ivy
Right,
League
right, right.
institution, but it is work that is actually hitting the streets, and that people can touch and feel and experience. And it's a way of mark making and a way of impact that will
Yes.
last way beyond, your physical manifestation in this space time reality. And so thank you, thank you, thank you for that, Tara.
Thank you, thank you. No, and I always love being in conversation with you because you have that sort of space of translation and sharing. I think is a space that you're kind of constantly creating and making that space. And yeah, and I do try to kind of have this combination of both kind of mark making and kind of sharing the I mentioned earlier project I worked at the city for a long time was a whole neighborhood development, and like one of my favorite things in the world to do is just go there and sit in a place and just see like life happening.
Mm,
It's like just all these people's lives and knowing that like helped create a space that life is happening within, right?
mm.
um, uh, Lives not connected to mine at all, and lives that are connected to mine, and it's something that I love, and it does take kind of sharing and communication. So thank you for this platform. As to the Black imagination is a space for sharing and a space for the possible and for life. So thank you for creating that.
Oh my God, absolutely, my pleasure. And so Justin, what is the world that you imagine for the future? What's the world you're building?
Hmm. So I'll say this: a book I appreciate a lot is by um, Hardt and Negri, Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri, called "The Multitude." And there's this kind of idea that there are all of us, right? Like literally, like the billions of people on the planet all have kind of a value and a place in a space. And I think for a lot of different reasons, the world as it's sort of set up and the world as it's built really doesn't fully acknowledge that that there really is a responsibility to all of us. And so when I say that, it's funny. So like it's like the what's called the BIPOC conversation, right? Like when you explicitly start listing something out, it's either someone is left out or someone's not included. By saying all of us, that allows you actually the freedom and space to say for me, right? Or for my people, right? Because very often, right, like you'll end up not creating space for yourself and to be whole if you're concerned with a particular set. And so when you give permission to make a space for all of us, you give permission to make a space for yourself in the world. And so that's what I'm sort of constantly navigating. So, in our professional practice, we say things like equity and inclusion and accessibility of spaces and universal spaces and all of these things. It takes a lot of work to kind of navigate that and to be genuine about it and everything. But I really do want to have a world that creates that sort of combination that allows you to be full and present and happy and complete in a way in your space and in your environment.
Yeah, and ultimately just creating a space for yourself.
Yeah.
That is a beautiful place to end. Justin, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation. I cannot wait to actually go back and listen to it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Hopefully I didn't you too much, but
Oh, no, it was perfect. Justin is simply one of my favorite people in the world. Speaking of favorite people, we love this community and want to continue to expand it and make sure that people know about all the Black genius we have over here at the Institute of Black Imagination. And what better way to do that than to hear it from you? When you leave a review, it helps others find us. So take a moment and be sure to leave a review over on Apple Podcasts and share this episode with a friend. You can drop some of your thoughts with us over on Instagram and Twitter at Black Imagination, and be sure to check out this conversation and others at blackimagination.com. And you can watch this and other episodes on our new YouTube channel, the Institute of Black Imagination. As our sister Bell Hooks said, if we want a beloved community, we must stand for justice. Stay curious and keep dreaming.